The fire spread across Kepler Station like a living thing, and Jake Morrison watched it die from the bridge of his ship Meridian's Edge. The station had been home to 12 different alien races for over 2,000 years, but now it burned under the crystal ships of the Zephyrians, and nothing could stop them. Jake pressed his hand against the cold metal wall and felt the vibrations of his ship's engines working too hard to keep them alive. The Zephyrian fleet moved like a pack of metal wolves around the dying station, and their weapons cut through Coalition shields like they were made of paper and dreams. Amy Collins sat at the communications desk with her fingers dancing over the controls, but her face showed the same fear that Jake felt in his chest. She had been trying to reach other Coalition ships for 3 hours, but most of them were already dead and floating in space like broken toys. The Zephyrians looked like walking crystal mountains when you saw them up close, and their ships changed shape as they fought like they were alive and thinking. No one in the Coalition had ever seen anything like them before they appeared from the dark edges of the galaxy 6 months ago with their message that all organic life was a disease that needed to be cleaned away. Jake watched another Coalition cruiser explode in a ball of white fire and counted the ships they had lost. 47 vessels in just 6 hours, and the Zephyrians had lost maybe 3 ships total. The math was simple and terrible, and it meant they were all going to die unless something changed fast. Amy's voice cut through the noise of alarms and dying systems when she said she had Admiral Ben Carter on the emergency channel. Jake took the communication and saw Carter's tired face on the screen, looking older than his 50 years with gray hair and lines around his eyes that had not been there last week. The Admiral's voice was steady, but Jake could hear something underneath it that might have been fear, or maybe just the weight of knowing that everything was ending. Carter told him that the Coalition's 7th Fleet was 3 systems away with 40 ships left alive, and they were coming to help. But Jake knew the numbers, and 40 ships would not be enough against 300 crystal wolves. Kepler Station's shields finally failed completely, and the Zephyrian weapons reached deep into the heart of the ancient structure, where millions of beings had lived and worked and loved. Jake saw the explosion through his ship's cameras and felt something break inside his chest, because Kepler had been neutral ground where even enemies could meet safely, and now that was gone forever. Amy managed to send out one last message before the communication arrays melted under crystal fire, and Jake hoped someone would hear it and remember them. The message carried the coordinates and the enemy numbers, and maybe a warning that would help others survive even if they could not. The Zephyrian ships turned toward the remaining Coalition vessels like hunting animals that had finished with their first prey and were ready for the next course. Jake ordered his weapons officer to prepare everything they had left, but he knew their plasma cannons would barely scratch the crystal hulls that seemed to repair themselves even as you watched. Carter's face appeared on the screen again, and this time, Jake saw something different in the Admiral's eyes. It was not hope exactly, but it was not defeat either, and Jake had served under Carter for 5 years and knew that look meant the Admiral had one more card to play. Carter's words came through the static and interference like a prayer being answered. He said humanity had something they had kept secret since joining the Coalition, and now was the time to use it. Jake felt his heart beat faster because humanity was still new to galactic politics, and most of the older races treated them like children who had just learned to walk between the stars. The Admiral explained that there was a human ship coming, and it was different from anything the Coalition had ever seen. Jake wanted to ask questions, but there was no time because the Zephyrian fleet was moving closer, and his own ship was taking hits that made the hull ring like a bell.
Amy suddenly looked up from her station with wide eyes and said there was something new on the long-range sensors. It was big, and it was coming fast, and it was broadcasting human identification codes that she had never seen before. Jake felt
something that might have been hope start to grow in his chest like a small flame in the darkness. The Coalition ships that were still alive began to pull back from the Zephyrian fleet, and Jake ordered his pilot to follow them. Whatever was coming had better be good, because they did not have much time left, and the crystal ships were already adapting their weapons to break through Coalition defenses more easily. Jake looked at the tactical display and saw the Zephyrian formation spread out like a net to catch the fleeing Coalition vessels. They moved with the confidence of predators who knew their prey could not escape, and Jake had to admit they were probably right. 40 Coalition ships against 300 crystal wolves was not much of a fight, no matter what secret weapon humanity might have. But Admiral Carter had not given up, and that meant something. because Carter had fought in more battles than anyone else in the Coalition fleet. If he thought there was still a chance, then maybe there was, and Jake decided to believe in that chance because the alternative was giving up and watching everything they had fought for disappear into crystal fire. Amy called out that the new contact was almost in weapons range, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. Whatever came next would decide whether the Coalition survived or whether the Zephyrians would continue their march across the galaxy until every organic world was silent and dead and perfect in their crystal eyes. The thing that came out of hyperspace was bigger than anything War Master Kethvar had ever seen in his 3 centuries of war and conquest. His crystal body shifted colors from calm blue to warning orange as his sensors tried to make sense of the massive shape that appeared at the edge of his fleet's formation. Kethvar had destroyed 800 Coalition ships in the past cycle, and each victory had been easy because the organic races fought with outdated weapons and predictable tactics. They used energy beams and plasma charges like children playing with toys, while the Zephyrian fleet adapted and evolved with each battle until no organic weapon could touch their crystal hulls. The new ship stretched nearly 2 kilometers from front to back, and its hull was made of some dark metal that seemed to drink light instead of reflecting it. Strange angular shapes covered its surface like the spines of some deep space creature, and Kethavar's tactical computers could not identify most of the objects attached to the human vessel. Captain Lisa Hayes stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution and felt the weight of 400 human lives depending on her decisions. She had fought in the Sol Defense Wars when humanity nearly destroyed itself over the asteroid mining rights, and she had learned that war was not about honor or glory but about making the hard choices that kept your people alive. Her crew was the best that humanity could offer, and every one of them had earned their place through blood and sacrifice in the cold vacuum between worlds. They had trained in environments that would kill most galactic species, and they had learned to fight where there were no rules except survival and victory. Chief Weapons Officer Ryan Torres ran his hands over controls that would make physicists across the galaxy weep if they understood what he was preparing. The Retribution carried weapons that had been developed during humanity's darkest hours. When they fought each other for rocks and ice in the emptiness between planets, Hayes looked at the tactical display that showed 300 crystal ships arranged in perfect formation, like they were attending a parade instead of preparing for battle. The Zephyrians had never faced an enemy that could truly challenge them, and their confidence would be their weakness. Ryan's voice was calm when he reported that all weapon systems were online and ready to fire. The railguns were charged with tungsten rounds that could punch through solid steel like it was paper, and the nuclear torpedoes were armed with warheads that could crack small moons in half. The Zephyrian War Master sent a communication demand to the human ship, and Hayes accepted it because she wanted Kethavar to see her face when she delivered humanity's message. The crystal being appeared on her screen like a living sculpture made of blue and orange light, and his voice sounded like wind blowing through broken glass. Kethavar demanded that the organic ship surrender immediately and prepare to be cleansed from the galaxy, along with all other forms of biological contamination. Hayes listened to his speech about crystal perfection and the purity of silicon life, while she studied the enemy formation through her tactical computers. When the War Master finished talking, Hayes opened her own communication channel to the entire Zephyrian fleet. Her voice was steady and cold when she told them they had 60 seconds to surrender or be destroyed, and every crystal ship in the enemy formation would be given one chance to withdraw from the battlefield. The response was exactly what Hayes expected, because species that had conquered most of the galaxy did not surrender to single ships no matter how large they might be. The Zephyrian fleet began to turn toward the Retribution like a pack of hunters that had found new prey to chase and kill. Navigation Officer Kate Rodriguez had been calculating firing solutions since they dropped out of hyperspace, and her computers had identified the critical weak points in every enemy vessel. The Zephyrians built their ships to resist energy weapons, but they had never encountered kinetic rounds traveling at 15% of light speed. Hayes gave the order to engage stealth systems, and the Retribution disappeared from Zephyrian sensors like a ghost fading into darkness. The enemy fleet suddenly found themselves shooting at empty space, while the human ship moved through their formation like a predator stalking its prey. The first tungsten rounds struck 3 Zephyrian cruisers simultaneously, and the crystal ships simply ceased to exist as coherent structures. The kinetic projectiles passed completely through their hulls, leaving perfectly round holes that compromised structural integrity across multiple decks and caused catastrophic system failures. Karthavar felt his ship shake under weapons fire that his species had never experienced before, and his tactical computers screamed warnings about projectile weapons and solid matter impacts. The Zephyrian adaptive defenses were useless against chunks of metal that ignored energy shields and punched through crystal hulls like they were made of ice. Commander Paul Jenkins launched his fighter squadron from the Retribution's massive hangar bays and led 18 heavily armored bombers toward the enemy formation. These were not the sleek, single-pilot craft that most galactic races preferred, but ugly functional machines built to carry nuclear payloads through enemy fire and deliver them to critical targets. The human fighters moved through the battle space using debris from destroyed Zephyrian ships as cover while they approached their assigned targets. Jenkins had studied every major space battle in human history, and he knew that concentrated firepower applied to command vessels would break enemy coordination faster than any other tactic. Hayes watched her tactical display as red dots representing enemy ships began to disappear one by one under the combined assault of kinetic weapons and nuclear strikes. The Zephyrian fleet tried to adapt, but their evolution-based combat systems needed time to analyze new threats, and humanity was not giving them that time. Ryan's weapons continued to fire with mechanical precision, and each shot was calculated to cause maximum damage to critical systems. Engine compartments exploded under tungsten impacts, and weapon arrays melted under nuclear fire, while the Zephyrian ships struggled to understand what was happening to them. Within 23 minutes, the enemy fleet of 300 vessels was reduced to 78 damaged ships, trying to flee in all directions. Hayes felt no satisfaction in the victory, because war was not about winning, but about ending conflicts as quickly as possible with minimum loss of life on both sides. The galaxy had been watching through long-range sensors, and every major species was analyzing what they had just witnessed. A single human vessel had accomplished what the combined coalition forces could not manage in 3 cycles of warfare, and the implications would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. The surviving Zephyrian ships fled through space like wounded animals, and Captain Hayes watched them go, while her finger rested on the firing controls. Her weapons were fully charged, and her targeting computers had perfect locks on every retreating vessel, and standard military doctrine demanded that she destroy enemy forces before they could regroup and attack again. Hayes felt the weight of 400 years of human military tradition pressing down on her shoulders, because every war college and every battle manual said that letting enemies escape was a mistake that would cost lives later. Her own crew expected her to finish what they had started and eliminate the crystal ships before they could warn their empire about human capabilities. Lieutenant Commander Steve Parker stepped forward from his tactical station and spoke the words that were burning in every crew member's mind. He asked why they were letting the Zephyrians escape when they could end the threat permanently with a few more shots, and Hayes knew the question was fair because Parker had lost friends to crystal weapons over the past months. Hayes turned to face her bridge crew and saw the confusion in their eyes, because they had trained for total warfare, where mercy was a luxury that got your people killed. She understood their feelings, because she had felt the same way during the Sol Defense Wars when humanity nearly destroyed itself over resources and territory. The captain's voice was steady when she explained her decision to the bridge crew, and through them to the galaxy that was listening on every communication frequency. She said they had come to stop a massacre, not to commit one, and the retreating Zephyrians were no longer combatants but refugees fleeing from a superior force. Ryan Torres looked up from his weapons console with doubt written across his face, because everything in his training said that enemies who escaped today would kill your friends tomorrow. Hayes met his eyes and told him that strength without mercy was just another form of tyranny, and humanity had fought too many wars to forget that lesson. The UES Retribution began rescue operations, while the last Zephyrian ships disappeared into hyperspace, and Hayes ordered her medical teams to prepare for both human and alien casualties. Dr. Michelle Turner led her staff toward the shuttle bays, with medical supplies for species they had never treated before, but she had taken an oath to help all living beings regardless of their origin. Hayes opened communication channels to the damaged coalition vessels that were scattered across the battlefield like broken toys. Jake Morrison's ship Meridian's Edge was badly hurt, but still functional, and his crew was already working to rescue. Survivors from other coalition vessels that had been less fortunate. Amy Collins coordinated the rescue efforts from her communication station, and her voice remained calm, even though she was organizing the most complex, multi-species medical operation in galactic history. Human shuttles moved between the wreckage, pulling out survivors while Zephyrian wounded were treated with the same care as coalition personnel. The political implications of showing mercy to genocidal enemies spread across the galaxy faster than light itself, and every government from the Altarian Trade Federation to the Centauri Democratic Alliance began emergency sessions to discuss this unprecedented development. Humanity had demonstrated overwhelming military superiority and then chosen restraint instead of revenge. Dr. Turner worked alongside her medical team in the Retribution's main hospital bay, where human doctors treated crystal beings whose biology was completely different from anything they had studied. The Zephyrians bled something that looked like liquid metal, and their wounds healed differently than organic tissue, but Turner's people adapted because saving lives was what they did best. The most seriously wounded Zephyrian was War Master Kethvar, whose command ship had taken a direct hit from one of the human nuclear torpedoes. His crystal body was cracked in several places, and his internal light flickered weakly as human medical equipment tried to understand how to help a silicon-based life form. Turner herself worked on the War Master, while her assistants treated other crystal beings, and she found herself talking to him as she worked because talking helped her concentrate. She explained that humans had learned medicine during their own wars, and they knew that healing was more important than the politics that caused the fighting. Kethavar's voice was weak, but he managed to ask why the humans were helping their enemies instead of letting them die as they deserved. Turner looked into his crystal eyes and told him that deserving had nothing to do with it, because every living being had value regardless of what they had done in the past. The War Master had lived for 3 centuries and conquered dozens of worlds, but he had never encountered the concept of mercy from a superior military force. His species believed that might made right, and the strong were justified in destroying the weak. But these humans had proven their strength and then chosen to heal instead of harm. Hayes received reports from her rescue teams that they had saved over 2,000 coalition personnel and nearly 500 Zephyrians from the battlefield. The operation took 18 hours of constant work, but her people never complained because they understood that this was what separated humanity from its enemies. Admiral Carter arrived with the remnants of the 7th Fleet, expecting to find a graveyard full of coalition dead, but instead he discovered a thriving medical operation where former enemies worked together to save lives. His flagship docked with the Retribution, and Carter came aboard to see for himself what his people had accomplished. The Admiral found Hayes in the medical bay where she was helping Dr. Turner treat wounded crystal beings, and Carter realized that something fundamental had changed in galactic warfare. Humanity had entered the interstellar community 6 months ago as the newest and least experienced member, but now they were showing ancient civilizations what strength really meant. Carter spoke privately with Hayes in her ready room and asked if she understood the risks of showing mercy to an enemy that had committed genocide against organic species. Hayes told him she understood perfectly, but that understanding was not the same as accepting, and humanity had to choose what kind of civilization they wanted to become. The rescue operation continued for 3 more days while Coalition and Zephyrian medical teams learned to work together, treating casualties from both sides. Human engineers helped repair damaged Coalition vessels while also providing aid to crippled crystal ships that had been abandoned by their fleeing comrades. Word spread across the galaxy that humanity had demonstrated the most devastating military capability anyone had ever seen, and then used that power to protect both friends and enemies. The concept was so alien to most galactic civilizations that they had no words to describe it in their own languages. Hayes stood on her bridge looking out at the repaired Kepler station, where human and Zephyrian engineers worked side by side to rebuild what had been destroyed. She knew that this moment would be remembered long after all of them were dead, because they had chosen mercy, when vengeance would have been easier, and that choice would echo through galactic history. 3 weeks after the Battle of Kepler Station, the galaxy looked different than it had for 1,000 years, and War Master Kethavar stood in his crystal chambers, trying to understand what had happened to his certainty about the universe. His body had healed from the wounds he suffered in battle, but something deeper had been damaged that no Zephyrian medicine could repair. The human doctor Michelle Turner had saved his life using techniques that his species did not possess, and she had done it without asking for anything in return. Kethvar had spent 3 centuries believing that mercy was weakness, and that the strong were justified in destroying the weak, but the humans had proved their strength and then chosen healing instead of harm. Captain Hayes received a message from the Zephyrian High Command, requesting peace negotiations for the first time in their species' recorded history. The crystal beings had never asked for peace because they had never encountered an enemy that could defeat them decisively and then choose not to complete the destruction. Hayes stood in her ready room looking out at the rebuilt Kepler station, where engineers from a dozen different species worked together on projects that would have been impossible just a month ago. Human technology was being combined with Zephyrian crystal growth techniques to create structures that were stronger and more beautiful than anything either species could build alone. The peace talks were scheduled to take place aboard Kepler station because it had become a symbol of cooperation between former enemies and neutral ground, where even the most bitter adversaries could meet safely. Lieutenant Chris Logan had insisted on incorporating Zephyrian building methods into the station's reconstruction, and the result was something unprecedented in galactic architecture. Admiral Carter arrived with the full coalition fleet expecting to find a war zone that needed massive military presence, but instead he discovered a bustling center of interspecies cooperation. Human vessels docked alongside Zephyrian crystal ships while their crews shared technical knowledge and cultural exchanges that had been unthinkable just weeks before. Hayes found herself at the center of galactic diplomacy, even though she was a military officer who had never been trained for political negotiations. The other coalition species looked to humanity for leadership because they had demonstrated both the power to destroy enemies and the wisdom to show mercy when victory was complete. The first formal peace meeting took place in a conference room that had been built using both human engineering and Zephyrian crystal growing techniques. The walls seemed to pulse with their own internal light, while holographic displays showed star charts and treaty proposals in languages that most attendees could barely understand. Kethvar represented the Zephyrian Empire along with 2 other war masters, who had witnessed human military capability firsthand and survived to tell about it. They sat across from Hayes and the coalition representatives like students trying to learn a new way of thinking about conflict and resolution. Hayes began the negotiations by acknowledging that both sides had suffered losses, and that the goal was not to assign blame, but to prevent future conflicts. She spoke about the human concept of justice through restoration rather than revenge, and explained that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. The Zephyrian war masters listened with growing confusion, because their entire civilization was built on the idea that superior force justified any action. They had conquered worlds and destroyed species because they believed that crystal life was inherently better than organic existence. But the humans had proven themselves superior and then chosen restraint. Jake Morrison attended the peace talks as a representative of the coalition military forces, and he watched the former enemies trying to understand each other with something like wonder. Just a month ago, he had been certain that they were all going to die under Zephyrian weapons, but now he was watching crystal beings learn about mercy from the species they had tried to exterminate. Dr. Turner presented medical data showing how human and Zephyrian physiology could complement each other in ways that neither species had imagined. Silicon-based healing techniques could help organic beings recover from certain injuries, while human surgical methods could repair crystal damage that had been considered permanent. The negotiations continued for days, while news of the peace talks spread across the galaxy and changed the way that dozens of species thought about warfare and diplomacy. Ancient enemies began to reconsider conflicts that had lasted for centuries, while new alliances formed between civilizations that had never trusted each other before. Hayes received a priority message from Earth informing her that humanity had been offered full membership in the Galactic Coalition Security Council, with the UES Retribution designated as the flagship of the new interspecies defense force. The offer came with resources and responsibilities that would transform humanity, from newcomers into leaders of galactic civilization. The final peace agreement included provisions for joint research projects between human and Zephyrian scientists, along with cultural exchange programs that would help both species understand each other better. Military cooperation clauses established protocols for combined operations against threats that might endanger any member of the galactic community. HFY signed the treaty with a crystal stylus that left glowing marks on the agreement documents, and his signature represented the first time in Zephyrian history that his species had voluntarily limited their own military actions. The War Master looked at Hayes and told her that humans had taught his people something they had never learned in 3 centuries of conquest. Hayes accepted the stylus from HFY and added her own signature to the documents that would reshape galactic politics for generations to come. She thought about all the coalition personnel who had died before humanity arrived, and wondered if they would approve of making peace with their killers. The treaty signing ceremony took place in Kepler Station's main assembly hall, where representatives from every major galactic civilization watched former enemies become allies. Hayes stood between Admiral Carter and War Master HFY, while cameras recorded images that would be studied in history classes for centuries. Amy Collins coordinated the communications that carried news of the peace agreement to every inhabited system in known space, and her messages included video recordings of human medical teams treating wounded Zephyrians alongside coalition casualties. The images of former enemies working together to save lives became symbols of hope for civilizations that had given up on peaceful coexistence. Lieutenant Commander Parker approached Hayes after the ceremony and admitted that he had been wrong to question her decision to show mercy to retreating enemies. He said that watching crystal beings learn about compassion from humans had taught him that there were some victories that could only be won through restraint rather than violence. Hayes looked out at the mixed fleet of human and Zephyrian vessels that would soon begin joint patrols to protect neutral shipping lanes from pirates and raiders. The sight of former enemies working together represented everything that humanity hoped to achieve in their new role as galactic peacekeepers and protectors of civilized space. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler Station, the galaxy had learned a new word, and Captain Hayes heard it spoken in dozens of languages every time she visited a coalition world. The word was hope, and it carried with it the idea that conflicts could end in something better than victory or defeat. Hayes stood on the bridge of the UES Retribution as her ship led a combined fleet of human and Zephyrian vessels toward the Outer Rim, where reports of piracy had been increasing. The sight of former enemies working together as crew members on each other's ships represented a transformation that most galactic observers had thought impossible. War Master HFY served as her second-in-command, and his crystal form had adapted to show new colors that Zephyrian scientists were still trying to understand. The blue and orange patterns that had once indicated aggression and territorial dominance had been replaced by softer hues that seemed to represent something like contentment or peace. The Interspecies Defense Force had grown to include vessels from 17 different civilizations, and each ship carried mixed crews that shared technical knowledge while learning to work together despite fundamental biological differences. Human engineers taught Zephyrian crystal shapers, while alien botanists helped human farmers adapt crops to new environments. Dr. Turner had established medical schools on 12 different worlds, where organic and silicon-based doctors learned to treat patients whose biology was completely unlike their own. The techniques developed during the emergency treatment of battle casualties had evolved into revolutionary healing methods that were saving lives across the galaxy. Hayes received daily reports from Admiral Carter, who now commanded the Coalition's expanded 7th Fleet from his new headquarters on Kepler Station. The rebuilt facility had become the unofficial capital of a new kind of galactic civilization, where former enemies shared resources and knowledge instead of competing for dominance. Jake Morrison commanded his own squadron of mixed coalition vessels, and his ship Meridian's Edge flew alongside crystal destroyers, whose commanders had once tried to kill him. Morrison had learned to speak basic Zephyrian, and his friendship with former enemy officers had become a model for cooperation that was being copied throughout the fleet. Amy Collins had been promoted to communications director for the entire Interspecies Defense Force, and her job involved coordinating information flow between civilizations that used everything from electromagnetic signals to quantum entanglement for long-distance messaging. Her work required her to think in ways that would have been impossible before humanity encountered alien technology. The combined fleet dropped out of hyperspace near the Vega system where pirate raids had been terrorizing merchant vessels for the past month. The raiders were using stolen coalition technology combined with black market Zephyrian weapons to create hybrid ships that were faster and more dangerous than anything the local defense forces could handle. Hayes studied the tactical reports, while Kethavar analyzed the energy signatures from pirate weapon systems, and both officers quickly realized that they were dealing with criminals who had learned to combine the worst aspects of multiple military technologies. The pirates were using coalition stealth systems to hide while employing Zephyrian adaptive weapons to overcome defensive measures. The first engagement took place near Vega Prime, where a merchant convoy was under attack by 6 pirate vessels that scattered like startled fish when the defense force fleet appeared. Hayes ordered her ships to pursue while being careful to avoid civilian casualties, because protecting innocent lives was more important than capturing criminals. Lieutenant Chris Logan had modified the Retribution's engines with Zephyrian crystal enhancement technology that allowed the massive human ship to keep pace with smaller and supposedly faster pirate vessels. The combination of human engineering and alien materials had produced capabilities that neither species could have achieved alone. The pirate ships tried to use hit-and-run tactics, but they quickly discovered that the defense force had learned to counter every known form of space combat through the shared experience of multiple civilizations. Human kinetic weapons worked alongside Zephyrian energy beams while alien point defense systems protected vulnerable areas of each ship. Commander Paul Jenkins led a mixed squadron of human and Zephyrian fighters in a coordinated strike that disabled the pirate flagship without destroying it completely. The goal was to capture the criminals alive so they could be questioned about their sources for stolen military technology and prosecuted according to galactic law. Hayes personally led the boarding party that captured the pirate crew, and she was surprised to discover that the criminals included members of several different species, working together for profit rather than ideology. The diversity of the pirate organization reflected the new galactic reality, where cooperation was becoming more common than conflict. The interrogation of captured pirates revealed a network of arms dealers who were selling stolen military equipment to anyone with enough credits to pay for it. The criminal organization included corrupt officials from multiple governments, along with military officers who were willing to betray their own species for personal gain. Hayes coordinated with law enforcement agencies from 6 different civilizations to track down the arms-dealing network, and her investigation led to arrests on dozens of worlds. The cooperation between former enemies in fighting crime had become as important as their military alliance in protecting peaceful commerce. Kethavar proved to be particularly effective at interrogating crystal-being criminals because he could detect lies through bioluminescent patterns that were invisible to organic species. His ability to read the emotional states of his own people made him invaluable in breaking up Zephyrian criminal organizations that had been considered untouchable. The success of the anti-piracy campaign led to requests for defense force assistance from civilizations throughout the galaxy, and Hayes found herself commanding operations that would have required entire battle fleets just a year earlier. The combination of military technologies from multiple species had created capabilities that no single civilization possessed. Dr. Turner received reports from medical facilities across the galaxy showing dramatic improvements in survival rates for accident victims and disease patients who were being treated with combined organic and silicon techniques. The healing methods that had been developed during wartime were now saving thousands of lives during peacetime emergencies. Hayes stood in her ready room reading messages from Earth that described the changes taking place in human society as news of galactic cooperation reached the home system. The Sol Defense Force was being reorganized to focus on exploration and scientific research instead of preparing for war against other human factions. The final report of her first year as commander of the Interspecies Defense Force showed achievements that Hayes had never imagined possible when she first encountered Zephyrian forces at Kepler Station. Former enemies had become trusted allies, while criminal organizations that had operated freely for decades were being dismantled through international cooperation. Hayes received a personal message from War Master Kethavar, thanking her for teaching his species that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them. The crystal being had learned to understand concepts like mercy and compassion that had been completely alien to Zephyrian culture for thousands of years. The galaxy had indeed stood silent when humanity's warship arrived on the battlefield, but now it sang with voices from dozens of worlds celebrating the peace that had grown from the seeds of restraint and mercy. Humanity had not just won a battle or even a war, but had redefined what victory meant for an entire galaxy of civilizations learning to live together.